The warrior before Islam. In the heart of Makkah, a man walked with a fearless step, his eyes sharp like an eagle, his shoulders wide like a warrior trained by the deserts. He was known not only by his strength, but by his loyalty, courage, and unmatched skill in archery. His name was Hamza. The uncle of Prophet Muhammad. Zayd al-Hamza was born into the noble clan of Banu Hashim, raised among leaders, poets, and warriors. His early life was shaped by the heat of the Arabian sun and the pride of Quraysh. He was strong from a young age, known for wrestling, hunting, and riding horses across the harsh land. He became famous for his bold voice and bravery during hunts. It was said no lion dared cross him in the desert, and no man could challenge him in combat. He was the brother of a prophet through nursing. Both of them were suckled by Thuwaiba, the servant of Abu Lubab. This deepened their bond. Although Hamza was older, their hearts shared mutual respect and affection. But during his early life, Hamza did not follow the new message brought by his nephew. He was respected by all, even by those who disliked the Prophet. He was known for his balanced character, not swayed by gossip or hatred. In those days, the Quraysh had grown restless with Prophet Muhammad. His words about one God had shaken their pride and power. They could no longer tolerate the growth of Islam and began to persecute the Muslims harshly. They used torture, beatings, and threats to stop them from praying, from speaking, from gathering. But the Muslims stood strong, even as the sky over Makkah darkened. One day, as Hamza returned from a hunting trip, carrying his bow across his broad shoulders, a slave woman ran up to him, her voice trembling with anger and grief. She said, "Your nephew has been attacked again." Abu Jahl struck him while he sat near the Kaaba, mocked him in front of the people, and no one helped him. Hamza stood still for a moment, the sun behind him turning the sand golden. His heart burned. The fire of honor rose within him. This was not just an attack on his nephew, but a deep insult to his family, to his tribe, to justice. He walked straight to the Kaaba, his steps firm, his eyes like fire. There sat Abu Jahl, proud among his followers. Before anyone could speak, Hamza lifted his bow and struck him across the head. The sound echoed in the air. Blood ran down Abu Jahl's face. The crowd gasped in silence. Hamza shouted, "I follow the religion of Muhammad. Say what you will, but I now stand with him. I believe in his message and in his Lord. If you have the courage, face me now." Abu Jahl, stunned by both the blow and the words, dared not respond. His men looked away. None could challenge Hamza. That day something changed in Makkah. The streets whispered the name of Hamza, not as the hunter of lions, but as the protector of truth. Hamza returned home, his heart still pounding. He had made a declaration, not in private, but in the heart of the city, in front of the enemies of Islam. His soul was restless, not out of fear, but because of the weight of his decision. He sought out Prophet Muhammad and said, "O nephew, I have declared that I follow your religion, but I do not yet know all of it, so pray that Allah opens my heart to what is right." The Prophet Asadullah embraced him, his eyes filled with joy and tears. He prayed for him, and Allah guided Hamza. His heart began to soften, not in weakness, but in faith. He learned about prayer, about the mercy of Allah, about the day of judgment, and the purpose of life. The Muslims welcomed him with hope. They had gained not only a strong believer, but a warrior, a shield in a time when they were few and weak. Hamza stood with them in the face of danger. His presence lifted their spirits, gave them courage. In moments of fear, the Quraysh were furious. They had lost a powerful ally and gained a bold enemy. They tried to bribe him, to warn him, to remind him of status and pride. But Hamza stood firm. He said, "I have found what my heart was missing. I will never return to darkness." His days were now filled with learning, worship, and silent strength. He watched over the Prophet like a lion watches its cubs during gatherings, during prayers, during long walks through the valley. Hamza was there, like a wall that would never fall. As months passed, the hatred of Quraysh grew, but so did the unity of Muslims. Hamza became known not just in Makkah, but among all tribes around the land as the Lion of Allah, the man who gave up fame for faith, who rose not by sword, but by sincerity. He had once hunted wild beasts in the desert. Now he stood guard over the believers, over truth, over a mission that would one day change the world. But greater trials were still to come. The winds of war were rising, and the Lion of Allah would soon show the world what it truly meant to be brave. Becoming the Lion of Allah, the days in Makkah had grown darker for the believers. The Quraysh tightened their grip through threats, exile, and brutal punishment. But something had changed in the hearts of the Muslims ever since Hamza joined them. Their spirits rose high because they knew someone now stood between them and the spears of their enemies. Hamza was not just a man of strength, he was a man of heart. He had lived a life of pride before Islam, but now his pride was in the truth, in standing shoulder to shoulder with the weak and the oppressed. He attended every gathering with the Prophet, saw his presence calming those around him like a mountain that never moved. At night, he would stand in prayer, learning the verses of the Quran slowly from the lips of the Prophet. The words entered his soul, shaking everything he thought he once knew. He was learning that true strength came not from weapons or titles, but from submission to the one who created all things. The Quraysh began to fear Hamza more than ever. He was once one of them, a respected warrior. Now he had turned into their greatest obstacle. When they planned something against the Prophet, it was Hamza who stood in the way. When they insulted the faith, he silenced them with his words, and when they raised their hands, he raised his sword. Muslims now had a protector, not in secret, but in public, and this disturbed the Quraysh leaders. One day, they called a secret meeting where the likes of Abu Sufyan, Abu Lahab, and others gathered around a fire to discuss how to weaken the believers. They whispered about bribes and alliances, but the shadow of Hamza stood over every plan they made. Hamza continued to train not for war, but to stay strong for what might come. He would ride out into the desert with young companions, teaching them archery, horse riding, and discipline, but also reminding them of patience and faith. He was not just a warrior anymore. He had become a mentor, a guardian, a servant of Islam. One morning, word spread quickly that the Quraysh were planning to kill the Prophet. In his home that night, when Hamza heard it, his blood turned cold. He rushed through the narrow streets, his footsteps echoing against the stone walls, and when he reached the Prophet, he found him calm and in prayer. As always, Hamza stood outside that house the entire night, watching the shadows, the rooftops, every sound, his hand on the hilt of his sword, daring anyone to come close. No one came, but that night marked a new beginning. Hamza knew now that Islam would not survive without sacrifice, and that he had to be ready to give everything he had. Not long after this, the migration to Medina began slowly in secret. The believers left behind their homes and their wealth to build a new life, a life where they could live free and worship their Lord without fear. Hamza was one of the last to leave, staying behind to protect the Prophet until it was safe. When he finally reached Medina, the city welcomed him like a hero, but Hamza remained humble. He helped in building the masjid, carried bricks with his own hands, worked under the sun with the rest of the Muslims. He would sleep on simple ground, eat simple food, and keep a soft smile. Even in hardship in Medina, he grew close with the Ansar, the helpers of Islam, and taught them what he knew about strength, not just of body, but of character. He trained with them, prepared them for the battles that might come, and reminded them that victory only came through obedience to Allah. Then came the call that would change history. The Quraysh had sent a caravan led by Abu Sufyan, filled with wealth and guarded by soldiers. It was heading back from Syria, and the Muslims planned to intercept it, not to steal, but to reclaim what had been taken from them. The Prophet called upon his companions to prepare for this mission. Hamza was among the first to respond. He polished his sword, wrapped his armor, and tied his turban. His eyes burned not with revenge, but with purpose. He was ready to fight, not for land, not for pride. but to defend what was true as the Muslims gathered for what would become the Battle of Badr. Hamza moved among them, offering words of courage, his voice steady like a commander, his heart firm like a believer. Before leaving, he sat alone in the desert, looking up at the stars, whispering, "O Allah, if I fall in battle, let it be in your cause, and not for anything else." He knew this would not be like the tribal battles of old. This would be between truth and falsehood, between faith and arrogance, between the oppressed and the oppressors. He was no longer just the uncle of the Prophet Saw. He was now the shield of Islam, the lion of Allah, ready to roar in the face of tyranny. As the army moved toward Badr, every step echoed with the sound of destiny, and Hamza walked among the ranks, a symbol of fear for the Badr Quraysh and a symbol of hope for the believers. But neither side knew yet how deeply his sword would cut, or how loudly his roar would shake the battlefield. Ahead, Battle of Badr and his heroism. The sun rose over the valley of Badr, its golden light falling on a small army of believers, their hearts firm, their faces calm, their weapons few, but their faith unshaken. Among them stood Hamza, tall and proud, his eyes focused on the horizon, his sword at his side, not for show but ready to strike for the sake of Allah. The Quraysh army was many times larger and heavily armed. They had come with pride, drums of war, beating through the desert dust. They wanted to crush the Muslims in one blow, but what they did not understand was that the strength of the Muslims came not from their numbers, but from their hearts, and in those hearts Hamza stood as a blazing fire. Before the main battle began, as was the custom of the Arabs, 3 warriors from each side stepped forward to fight in single combat. From the Quraysh came Utbah, Shayba, and Walid, all known for their skill and strength. They called for challengers, and the Muslims sent forward 3 young men from the Ansar, but the Quraysh refused, saying, "We want our equals from the Quraysh." Prophet then called upon 3 of the bravest men from among his companions, Hamza, and Ubaidah. Hamza stepped forward without hesitation, his eyes locked onto Shayba, a seasoned fighter known across Arabia. The 2 men faced each other in the silence of early battle, each step slow, each breath measured. Then, without warning, Hamza moved like lightning, his sword cutting through the air. The clash was loud and fierce, but within moments he had brought Shayba to the ground, his strike clean, his posture steady. He looked toward the sky and whispered a quiet praise to his Lord. Ali defeated Walid, while Ubaidah was wounded in the fight with Utbah, but with the help of his brothers, the enemy was struck down, and the 3 Muslim champions returned victorious, their swords dripping, their spirits lifted. The army cheered, but Hamza said nothing, his eyes still watched the field, knowing this was just the beginning. As the battle erupted, the air filled with dust and cries of war. Hamza became a force no one could stop. He moved through the battlefield like a lion through the jungle, his sword flashing, his voice roaring. Every time he struck, he shouted words of truth and remembrance. His face showed no fear, only purpose. Quraysh saw him, and many stepped back. None wished to meet him in combat. But Hamza did not fight for glory. He fought to protect the Prophet, to defend the believers, to honor the truth. He fought beside his nephew, shoulder to shoulder, and every time an enemy came near the Prophet, Hamza would intercept them, cutting them down without pause. His movements were powerful but controlled, his strikes were fierce but focused. He showed mercy when needed, but gave no chance to those who raised swords against the messenger of Allah. One of the Quraysh warriors who later embraced Islam would say, "I saw Hamza that day, fighting like a lion of the battlefield. No one dared face him, and those who did not survive by the end of the battle." 70 leaders of the Quraysh were killed, many captured. The Muslims had won, not with numbers, but with belief, not with wealth, but with sacrifice, and in that victory, Hamza stood among the greatest heroes, his clothes torn, his body bruised, but his heart full of peace. After the battle, he walked among the fallen. He did not boast. He did not laugh, he simply knelt in the sand and thanked Allah for allowing him to serve in his cause. The Prophet came to him, embraced him, and said, "Hamza, today you have shown the world what true courage is." The Muslims returned to Medina not as the weak and hunted, but as the defenders of truth. The city welcomed them with joy, and Hamza walked quietly among them, his sword tied at his side, but his voice humble. He was called the Lion of Allah by both friends and enemies, not because he was fierce, but because he fought for justice for the weak and for the word of Allah. But while the Muslims rejoiced, the Quraysh burned with rage. They mourned their losses and swore revenge, and among them was a woman who carried the deepest hatred, Hind, the wife of Abu Sufyan. She had lost her father, her uncle, and her brother in the Battle of Badr, and she blamed one man above all, Hamza. She went to a slave named Washi, a man known for his deadly skill with a spear. She promised him freedom and gold if he would kill Hamza in the next battle. Washi agreed, not out of hate, but for the reward. He began training, watching Hamza from afar, learning his movements, his walk, his presence. He prepared not to fight him face to face, but to strike from a distance like a shadow. Back in Medina, Hamza continued to live simply. He trained the young, he helped build the community, he joined the prayers and fasts, and always stood beside the Prophet. In every gathering, his love for his nephew had grown into deep faith, and his faith had become the center of his life. The signs of war were returning. The Quraysh were gathering again, this time to attack Medina, and the Muslims prepared to defend their city. The Prophet consulted with his companions. Some advised to stay inside the city and fight from defense. Others wanted to face the Quraysh outside. Hamza was among those who believed they should go out and meet the enemy with strength and courage. Decision was made they would march to the mountain of Uhud to meet the enemy head-on, and once again Hamza tightened his armor, sharpened his sword, and whispered his prayers, knowing that the coming battle would test more than just swords. It would test hearts. The sun set on the eve of battle. He stood on a hill overlooking the land of Uhud. The wind gentle on his face, his heart steady. He had fought in many battles, but something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the silence of the stars, or the weight in the air. He did not know that a spear had already been prepared for him, a spear guided not by courage but by a promise of freedom, and behind it stood a man hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The ultimate sacrifice. At Uhud, early morning light touched the slopes of Mount Uhud, painting the rocks in shades of gold and gray. The Muslim army stood ready, lined up near the mountain with the Prophet at its center. Their hearts were firm, but their numbers were small, barely over 700 warriors, while the Quraysh approached with more than 3,000 men, armed with pride, anger, and thirst for revenge. Among the believers stood Hamza, his face calm, his eyes bright with courage. He tightened the grip on his sword and looked toward the horizon, not out of fear, but with deep reflection. He had already faced death and come back stronger. This time he was ready, not just for battle, but for martyrdom. The Prophet gave instructions. He placed 50 archers on a small hill behind the army. He told them clearly, "Do not leave your position, no matter what happens, even if you see us winning. Do not move your post." The archers nodded and promised to obey. Hamza stood in the front lines where the fiercest fighting would occur, the place where warriors met face to face, where swords clashed and shields broke. He looked over at the Prophet and gave a small nod, a silent sign of trust and love, as the Quraysh army marched forward, their armor shining under the sun. A silence spread across the field. Then a cry echoed, and the Battle of Uhud began. Hamza moved like thunder across the battlefield, his sword flashing, his voice roaring verses of truth. He struck down enemy after enemy with precision and power, every movement filled with purpose. He became a wave of courage breaking through lines of pride. He was not just fighting, he was protecting. Every step he took was for the sake of Allah, for the safety of the Prophet, for the future of Islam. but far away behind a rock, a pair of eyes watched him silently. It was Washi the slave who had been promised freedom and wealth if he could kill the Lion of Allah. He carried a long spear balanced in his hand, hiding behind the rocks and broken shields. He followed Hamza with every step, waiting for the right moment to strike. Washi had no anger, no personal hatred in his heart. He was not a warrior in spirit, only a tool in the hands of those who burned with revenge. He admitted later, "I was not part of the fight. I only waited for Hamza, and when I saw him alone, I took my chance." Hamza had just struck down another Quraysh soldier when Washi stood quietly, lifted his spear, took aim, and with all his strength threw it across the air. The weapon flew straight, piercing deep into Hamza's body. The roar of the lion fell silent. Hamza stumbled, the sword dropped from his hand and he fell to the ground, his face turned toward the sky, his chest rising with one final breath. And then the battlefield lost one of its greatest heroes. Washi walked away quietly, leaving behind a man who had once hunted lions and now had become a legend in the path of truth. Battle continued. The Quraysh fled at first, but when the Muslim archers left their post, thinking victory was near, the enemy turned back and attacked from behind. Chaos spread, and the Muslims were caught between two forces. Even the Prophet was injured, his face wounded, his tooth broken. The news spread that he had been killed, but he was alive, protected by a small group of companions who fought with everything they had. After the battle ended, Muslims searched the field for the fallen. They walked among the dead, calling out names, tears falling with each step. When the Prophet found Hamza, he stood silently by his body, the ground around him soaked in blood and sorrow. His chest had been torn, his body mutilated by Hind, who had come after the battle seeking revenge for her loved ones. She cut his ears, his nose, and even tried to take out his liver in a twisted act of hate. The Prophet fell to his knees beside Hamza, his eyes filled with grief. He looked at his uncle, the man who had stood by him, who had fought for him, who had loved him like a brother, and he began to weep, not only for the pain and loss, but for the loyalty, for the faith, and for the deep bond they had shared. He said, "Never before have I felt pain like this, and never again will I stand beside a man like Hamza. He is the master of all martyrs. He is the Lion of Allah and his messenger." They brought the body of Hamza to be buried, but the Prophet ordered that he be left in the field of Uhud to be buried where he had fallen among the martyrs. They dug his grave beside another fallen companion and wrapped his body in a simple cloth. They had no shroud large enough to cover his entire body, so they covered his head and placed grass over his feet. As the people of Medina wept for their fallen, the Prophet stood among them and said, "Whenever you greet the martyrs, greet Hamza, for he is the most honored among them." Years passed, but the memory of Hamza never faded. The children of Medina would grow up hearing stories of his bravery, his strength, and his faith. In every gathering where courage was praised, his name was mentioned. In every battle after Uhud, his roar echoed in the hearts of the believers. Washi later came to the Prophet after embracing Islam. He stood ashamed and afraid, but the Prophet forgave him, though he said, "Do not appear before me often, for I still see Hamza in your face." Such was the deep pain he carried for the uncle he had loved so dearly. Hamza had died, but his legacy had just begun. He had lived as a warrior, died as a martyr, and risen as a symbol of sacrifice and loyalty. His story would be told for generations, not just as the uncle of the Prophet but as the man who stood when others feared, as the heart that beat with courage, as the sword that struck for justice. Had once walked the streets of Makkah strong and proud, but he left this world lying in the dust of Uhud, covered not in gold, but in blood, honored not by men, but by the angels above. And so the Lion of Allah rests not in silence, but in glory, his name etched in the hearts of all who believe, his footsteps followed by those who seek truth, and his roar forever alive in the echoes of history. The end.